Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave, on the board today is Sunday, September the 22nd, 2019, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, everything conservation-like and natural and everything like that, and whatever else Dave's been up to for the last week.
Busy week. It's fall, and the leaves are starting to turn. The early ones will be ones that, some of the southern plants that come up and they have drip tips, because in the tropical areas they have to have the water drop off the end. And there, I'm thinking of a spice bush that is... what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of pawpaw. And pawpaw starts to get its fall a little earlier, and it frosts earlier too. It has this wonderful fruit on them that taste like custard apples, which are real tropical flavour. And so it's time to look and note. You can pick up in the field, you can pick up waterways where the golden soybean at the moment is green because of the extra moisture. Or you can think of a lot of things as you go around. Someone who was bicycling came right down Market Street and asked me, he'd been past the Barnhart Prairie on Church Street, and he wanted to know if that was a real prairie. And I said, well, no, but it's a very, very good prairie. It's just got a lot of species in it, and it gives you a good idea of what a prairie was like. It may not have 50 or 60 species in it, but it has the common species, and they do well. And then the sort of more rare species that you might have to start in a greenhouse, and you have to watch that the deer don't eat it and things like that. So you have to be careful as you get from 12 species to 24 species to 36 species. You're starting to get into rare prairie. So I explained that we mostly are concerned about remnant prairies, where the bacteria and the fungi are still there, and the plants are interacting with each other. And we don't always have wonderful remnant prairies, but they're there. Not many of them, but we work at it. The farmers' market is still doing well. It's not doing quite as well as it used to, because the major companies have decided to get into vegetables and organic crops, and they have sections in supermarkets that are in competition with the farmers' market. But there are a lot of people who just get to the farmers' market to meet and talk to each other and play music and listen to music, or it's just rather wonderful. I have a prickly cucumber, which is a very prickly fellow. It grows very well. My father used to really enjoy eating it. You peel off the prickles, and then there's a cucumber, and it's very juicy. It's coming in the fall, along with the last of the zucchinis, or there's sometimes a second crop of zucchinis. They grow well too, despite the fact of some more downy mildew and insects and heat, which they can handle fairly well. And the butterflies and the bees are out there. Carrie had an interesting story. She has farmland where she picks up fruit and vegetables in southern Illinois, near Anna, and they have a problem with local theft. And she noticed 2 trees had not been harvested, apples I think they were, and she went to harvest them and then realized that they were not harvested for a good reason. There was a hornet's nest in them, and there was a hat on the ground. So she picked up the hat, and shortly later, a pickup truck came by, and she gave him his hat. And so he had been caught red-handed trying to steal fruit. And Carrie thought that was kind of an interesting way to catch up with people. She's mostly located in Champaign County, so she doesn't get down there to visit and see who is picking up fruit and vegetables. Let me look at my notes here. Yeah, I also passed a bunch of apple trees. They're out there in the boondocks, and they drop apples at this time of the year, which is kind of disappointing in a way. It's local. It may even be there because of Johnny Appleseed. But if those apples aren't picked up, the insects get involved, and fruit flies, and they're kind of a menace to orchards where those fruit flies multiply and get into good orchards. So in some communities where you have a lot of orcharding, you get fined for having apple trees dropped. It's all right if you have them and you pick up the bad ones and you burn them, or you bury them fairly deeply so that they don't give rise to a whole population of fruit flies. The flowers are there. I'm impressed by zinnias. They're always very, very active. And I've had 3 sitting outside next door in the street. They replaced a little pot of flowers that suddenly disappeared. So I put some 3 zinnias there. And so help me, it's almost 3 weeks and they're still blooming. So here's another little array of zinnias, and they're a very traditional plant, but they add a lot of color to a lot of our interests. There was a climate strike, and young people all around the world were begging their politicians to get more involved in what is a real loss of Arctic melting very quickly. It'll give rise to oceans that are already covering some of the islands in the Pacific, where you only have a 6-foot rise, and you have a big tsunami wave. It covers up those islands. There's a question of what to do with those people. There's a question of what we leave our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. There's just a lot of humans, and they have lots of rules of the game which often extend to making use of the environment. It's a question of, do we use it now and forget about the future, or do we preserve it? It's not an easy question. Most of our income has come from making use of the environment, but the young folk are starting to say, asked whether there should be more regulations, and I watched that too. It disappoints me, the amount of mowing. I just, everywhere there are mowers, and they're utilizing gasoline, and the equipment itself costs money, and the plants need to be there. And it has become sociologically important to have your front lawn mown, but it should also be ecologically appropriate for you to have a small prairie in the front yard, or trees, or gardens, or you don't really have to mow. So I'll talk about perhaps a little bit of that. We had a young group, home-schooled shamrocks. They come each year and come to a little prairie on Route 10, just near Seymour, near to Camp Creek. And they do two things. They, first of all, learn a little bit of prairie. We do for a walk. And then they harvest seed that is New Jersey seed, or ceanothus. And they just get a little experience of having to find the plant and harvest the seed. And then we walk them down the road to a weed patch where reed canary grass, or Phragmites, is invading. And our only answer to that at the moment is to dock off the heads and put them in sacks and burn them. There's a good questions from the children themselves to what do you do with these seeds? Well, we look for places that can do a burn plow, or better yet, have a formal incinerator. We don't have one of those, but it would behoove the community to have an incinerator that would pick up things like apples and pears and drop fruit and invasive weeds where we don't want the seeds to proliferate. So let me look at my notes here. Yes, the Grand Prairie, not the Grand Prairie Friends, the Natural Area Study Group, which has been in action for 35 years, was going to Weldon Springs. The whole purpose of the Natural Area Study Group is to find out about natural areas and to transmit that information to other people, whether it be in schools or parks or wherever, informally. And I was well aware that that to get to Weldon Springs, you have to go out Springfield Avenue, and that continues on as Route 10. And it parallels one of our railroad beds. There's 4 miles in the Seymour area, and then it continues through Lodge, DeLand, Weldon, to Lane, and then to Weldon Springs. And 5 miles of this railroad bed connects Clinton Power Plant Lake, which is a state-owned, or it works with the Ameren, or the people who own the power plant there, which has a cooling lake. So the temperature of the water of the lake is a little higher, but it makes for a recreational place, and it makes for fishing and just enjoyment. It's very near rolling territory, which is representative of the Hensley Moraine. We have lots of comments about the Pope Prairie, which is on the Bloomington Moraine. The glacial till that was dropped on the Hensley Moraine is a little bit drier. And so we had people who are familiar with the drier area vegetation and the oak hickory forest. So I led on the way out just to let people know that this is a tremendously valuable resource. We're hoping that as the Kickapoo Trail gets into action, that this one will also get into action and be a connector in a way. We do this under the aegis of the term that David gave at the outset: rails, trails, and greenways. Some of this territory can be re-railed, and in this case, the purpose would be to bring railroad vehicles from Monticello Railroad Museum into Champaign. So that will be a long, slow process, and it'll be probably involve several generations. If you're lucky, something happens quickly. Doesn't always assume that it will. But we need to get the skeleton together so that we can do that. So I stop off at Seymour to say, this is the end of the active line coming into Champaign. You go from Champaign on Springfield Avenue, you go Staley, Bonneville, Seymour. So 7 miles there has been recently abandoned. And so we stop off and let people know that this is real estate that we have to work with a group of railroad engineers, spin-off from the Railroad Museum, Tom Scott and others, that formed a group called the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad. And they already have gathered steel and ties to make this possible. It will start from the White Heath end and proceed slowly. You have to know that on a good railroad bed, you need 2,000 ties per mile. So we don't have easy access to trees anymore that provide 8-foot long, 9 by 5 inches ties. So we've tried to get second-hand ties, and that's a project. So very quickly I announced that, and then we go straight through Lodge, where there's a small elevator that will still give us an idea of what old small elevators were when towns were just 5 miles apart, and this was how you stored grain until you could rail it out. The railroad spurs were usually fairly short and only took a few cars at a time, and they're obsolete because these days the grain usually goes to fairly big units like Cargill on the way out to Mahomet, and they take out 125 cars at a time. So the little old wooden elevator sites with their towns around where probably 65% of the population either ran the railroad or ran the elevator. And the rest were farmers that brought grain into that elevator. So at Lodge, you then encounter a long, slow diversion from the Route 10 to a section road apart. So the Route 10 is on the section line and the railroad is on the half section. Often these little towns like Lodge and DeLand and Weldon and Lane were located other places or created by the fact that the railroads came in. Many of the original towns like Monticello were on the river, so you could, in flood time especially, you could come up the river with paddle wheelers or canoes. But Lodge, DeLand, and Weldon probably were created around the railroad. So we'd stop at some places so that you could see that. I didn't stop at a Prairie because you could. That's another topic. We were going to Weldon Springs. I nearly stopped at a spot at Lane. There's a house there, and the people who lived there were familiar with the traffic. The traffic used to go Champaign, Staley, Bonneville, Seymour, Whiteheath, and down through what is now the Railroad Museum to Monticello, and then on to Cisco and Argenta and Oriana and into Decatur. Then from Decatur they'd go up, traveling north to Clinton, and then they'd come back from Clinton through Weldon Springs, Lane, Weldon, DeLand, and Lodge, and back to Champaign. That was called a local train, and it lost out to the development when railroads were deregulated. Many of these railroad lines had been obsoleted by road traffic, and which often followed the railroad line. In instance, the Route 10, it followed the railroad line, only one section apart, or half a section apart. When we got to Weldon Springs, there's a very nice little prairie at the entrance. It's a reconstruction prairie. It's about 8 feet tall at the moment. It's just rather wonderful. And so we stopped there for a moment, and then to the concession area. And we took a 2.5 mile walk around the Weldon Springs Lake. Weldon Springs Lake was discovered or preserved in Abe Lincoln's day. It was way back then, and it's a 29-acre lake, but it's fed by artesian water. Underneath this springs, there is layers of sedimentary rock, not awfully rich, and it blocks water, and that water gradually leaks out. So damming it at one end, you can stand on the dam face and look down, and you can see this water trickling down, and that's about the amount of the artesian water. You can have artesian wells that spout. Once you open them up, they're very dramatic. There's one in Old Faithful is typical, and it has a timing. But this is more gentle, just a little trickle, and the lake is reasonably open, and there's vegetation in the lake itself. First of all, there's algae, and then there's duckweed, and a couple of varieties of duckweed, and just a vista that is reasonably healthy, and you have to go up and down because this is a morainic area, and you're going to have creeks, and then each creek that runs into this lake area and drains is going to give you a chance to go down into a swampland, and some of the swamp comes back, and so you get swamp species like what I'm trying to think of, smartweed, and weed, and they sort themselves out. We had a tremendous time just looking at a lot of different species and climbing up and down, and then vistas into the lake from different places, a memorial place for for servicemen. So it's for different purposes for different people. There's a boat ramp, and that allows people to put in a boat, or you can rent a boat, but you're not allowed to use a motor. You have to, if you're going to boat, you have to have a small electric motor, which is called a trolling motor. And I'm not familiar with dry area vegetation. I know hickories and the oaks and the like that are in dry areas, but we had a person, John, and I'm forgetting John's other name, and his avocation is vegetation, and so we spent quite a bit of time looking at the creatures, the vegetation, not so much the creatures. The bulk of the crew went rather faster. It's not unusual. Sometimes if I'm with people who want to go from A to B for exercise or for fun and moving fast, I can come out an hour and a half later, because on the way I'm looking at what you see, whether you encounter deer, which are too popular, too numerous, and they sort of look at you like, what are you doing on my territory? But a rather wonderful place to be at and to rest for a while. When my father passed some years ago, I went over there and just enjoyed myself being in a quiet place. And if you go on a weekday, it's much fewer people. This is a very popular state park, so you get a lot of room for recreational vehicles at park, and sometimes there's a whole family of recreational vehicles. They all know each other and they meet at this location. So, it's 5 miles of a railroad bed joins these two lakes. The visitor center opportunities at Weldon Springs have been closed in favor of having the Department of Natural Resources at Clinton Lake, where there are better facilities for having a crowd and introducing them to the natural area. But these two places are related, and there's also a nice little spot where there are little, what shall I say, groves where the water leaks out and runs down in a concreted pipe to the lake, and you can get an idea of the artesian nature of things. At this place, there used to be chautauquas, and chautauquas where you get together politicians and religious people and all sorts of people together. The railroads come by, and they have excursions for 5 cents to encourage people to get together. There are lots of tents and lots of people meeting together in a horse-drawn area. There's probably a bear or a few animals that are corralled for people to enjoy. The animals may not quite enjoy the same, but it's often alongside a river or something like Weldon Springs. And that might go on for a week. And you have to imagine that you didn't have television, you didn't have a lot of things. You did have music. So sometimes there would be a piano on a horse-drawn cart, and there would be music. And we didn't have microphones in those days. You tended to have loud music, and actually the saxophone was invented because of this sort of thing. For instance, in armies, a licorice stick or a clarinet doesn't make very much sound, and when you have trees around it, it absorbs it. Or what? It's handy to have a equipment like the saxophone, which is quite loud if you want to use it that way, and quite gentle at the same time. So this was a fun and games for local people who couldn't probably go more than 15 miles, because that would be about as much as a horse could take a buggy without getting overstressed. And you didn't necessarily gallop a horse, but they would have to move gently along, and that was a whole different era. You had to harness your horse, you had to say hi to your horse. Horses get to be part of the family, you know, and they get very jealous if one horse is used on a day out, and the other horse is kept in the stables because they didn't want two horses. And the horse that's left behind often objects to that, because it would like to be out and about too. So horses have their jobs, and it's rather wonderful. They even take it on a tour. I can remember where I was once. They had a new person on the milk truck, and the horse knew its route. And the guy who was delivering the milk didn't know his route, so after a while he was standing in the street. Did you see where my horse went? And the horse knew its way, and you can almost talk to your horse and know it. So those were the days, but you can replicate them some. And replanting areas is good. And our railroad bed goes right through 2 sections of Weldon Springs State Park, and we hope that one day that might be an adjunct part of the park, and that it might be a trail, and that the trail might not be too wide. I keep harping on that point, but really we want the vegetation on either side, and sometimes we've lost that to corn on either side, or soybeans. So, I think I said something about the Samanthas. Mm-hmm. These were young people, and when they went, I went looking around. After I was at the Weldon Springs, I went to see the city. The county seat had sent me a letter to say that somebody's wanting to build something near to the railroad bed, so I was investigating that. Not an invasive thing, it's just a friendly thing where if you're an associate, a nearby member, you get notified to appeal to the Zoning Board of Appeals. I went to the county garage to see if they had any problems. Sometimes when you have a railroad bed, its ballast is high, and vehicles go up and over that, and you can't quite see what's going on. So sometimes that rise has been an anathema to county people. So sometimes they want to carve that down so that road visibility is greater. I went to see farm families that are nearby. Visited with the Timmons, father and son, and they do a lot of hybrid corn work. And at this time, what happens is that farmers really can't grow their own seed very well, and the seed companies are not awfully excited about having them do that. So there are a bunch of families out west of Lodge and between the land, and they make rows of corn which are detasseled. High school students get to detassel those rows. So there's female corn cobs, but no male tassels. It's gotten to be that can be mechanized, so you can cut the tassels off without having to have a whole bunch of people do that job. In between each 4 rows of corn that have now no male parts, there's the male plants are planted in a row down the middle, and they are going to provide the pollen that will settle on the silks of the corn cob and create seed corn. And so there's a lot of that sort of activity. Those farmers don't always relish the weeds and seeds we have in the prairie, so either we get to be mown or utilized for corn, but it's understandable. But when the road that's adjacent gets mown, and it gets mown, and people who have mowers that are 15 feet wide, and they go a mile and a half, then they don't want to come back empty. So they mow another 15 feet. So in some cases, the mowing is 30 feet from the road. So I was looking for people who may have done that mowing because they just may not have realized that we only land next door, and we're jealous of the fact that it still has its natural plants and it has its bacteria and fungi and soils. So we don't really enjoy being invaded by a second mowing. And I've been at this before, but it's there. And when we put in a trail, then often the trail is designated as a wide one, and that also invades our natural history. So I went to several places. I also went to Incombressa. Incombressa owns a lot of land in that general area. They have elevators. They have a huge elevator in Gilman, and can take out 125 cars of grain. They're Brazilian in basic, so they speak Portuguese, and sometimes I have to talk to the children that speak English, and the managers don't necessarily speak English, so we have to call. I didn't catch up with Incombressa yet, but I will be at it. That's good. I went to Shady Rest, where we have a railroad bed that goes through what was Shady Rest, that was owned by a family that owned a paint store in Champaign, the Price family. And I just was checking out. We have a phone booth which mysteriously found its way into the middle of the railroad bed because it's a little higher than the swampland around. But it's taken me years to try and find out who owns it. The only way you'll get to know it, really, is to drive your car into it and take people off their phones. But it's infra-dig for people to put a phone booth on your land without necessarily communicating with you. The problem is that conservation areas are often regarded as unused land. This is land that is not producing money. The thing is that conservation is a form of use. It doesn't matter if it's sitting there for 30 years and not used, it's being used in a conservation sense. And the farmers who are nearby have been very, very generous and understanding and haven't invaded that much. But they also need that gene pool for, in some cases, we can take an undisturbed area and it's 1 foot higher than the farmland around because that much of the ground has been eroded. Part of that is because you have to plant soybeans, especially once every year, and you have to cultivate it, and it's easily erodible. So if you had a permanent soybean, a perennial soybean that grew each year, you didn't have to disturb it. You're looking for a new crop, so you're looking for a plant. Where do you have to find the plant? You have to find it in your genetic gene pool. You have to find the bacteria and the fungi and work at it for 50 years with 50 agronomists to make a new plant. Well, most farmers realize that if they want a new species, then they're going to have a gene pool. We didn't have soybeans in middle 1930s. People had to go around the world and find glycine and breed it. So University of Illinois has a gene pool that is tremendous for breeding, possibly a perennial soybean that you would mow for 20 years. 20 years it might need to be replaced, but it would reduce erosion. So when I see some of our stuff dug up or invaded as if it were weeds, then I have to remind people that this is a form of use. This is something that we need, and it's conservation easement, and it's tremendous. When I crossed the railroad bed at Shady Rest, there were a couple, and Scott Wiley had been there many years before. And what was Scott doing? We had salvaged a whole bunch of railroad ties. They were not necessarily railroad ties. They were bridge ties. They were bigger and better. And we'd store them at railroad at Shady Rest. Mrs. Price and the Price family had 30 acres of land there. And it was probably an early speculation. The railroad line that follows Route 10 takes a duck and goes to Whiteheath and down to Shady Rest and across the Sangamon River and then up to Lodge. The reason being that when railroads go to cross a river, they can follow drainage basins down, and this means that construction people don't have to create a cutting or an area that has to be made new so the train can go down and up. And the rest of the land around is probably fairly swampy. So from Whiteheath to Shady Rest to Lodge, it's one of these where you go down and up, and sometimes you had people at the upper ends of these places, and if the train were loaded, it has to have speed up and go across the river in order to get up the other side. And sometimes if it's loaded too much, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, I can't. And that means that they have to cut that train in two and take one part into the next site and come back and pick up the other one. And that costs a whole day. So there are little stunts that you realize why the railroad took a move to the west in order to make use of a drainage basin. It's called Madden Creek, but there's also other creeks that have little bridges across. And what Scott and his and associates, senators and others, had an organization, and they'd offered to come and put ties between the ties. when people walk over a bridge and they've never had a height to walk on, even 12 feet above the water is challenging. So we tend to drop a tie between the ties so that we leave an inch apart so that you can drain the water so the ties don't rot. But it's much more acceptable. You can sit on the bridge, you can lie down and look at the structure of a truss bridge and enjoy yourself a little bit more freely. And Scott had been driving a bobcat. They brought the equipment and deliver the ties to the bridge and to the ramp, the approach ramp. And so he was back looking at some of his territory that we did this many years ago. This is stuff that's taking 30 years to get into action, and not unusual. But it's nice to see people coming back and just looking and seeing what we've done or what we've not done and what we might do. And part of it is, do you have the Railroad Museum to come down to Shady Rest? Do you have a Chautauqua there? Do you have trails through the natural area? And associated people have helped to put this into the Piatt County Forest Preserve, so there are trails. And the area is just alive with understory plants. And wow, so the state has designated it through the Committee on Commission on Natural Areas Commission has designated it as a soil and water conservation easement. So what do you do? Do you have a trail? Do you have a rail? Mrs. Price was very interested in preserving the truss bridge there, and so she put in quite a helpful amount of money to preserve that. So we have some responsibility to honor that setup. And Mrs. Price has passed on now, but it's an area which is sort of hidden, and people will come there with their motorcycles and go off the trail, and it's an area where you really need the surveillance of the Piatt County Forest Preserve. But it was interesting that I arrived in my survey of the railroad bed, and Scott Wiley was there, and looking at the bed being a little overgrown. We could use some volunteers to open it up a little bit, but we don't want to open it up so much that it becomes a site for motorcycles and the like. And we were talking about a telephone booth, junction box, right in the middle of the trail. And so you have to know that if you're not watching, odd things will happen, sometimes to advantage. I came back by Camp Creek, and Camp Creek this year was very helpful for the Samanthas, and it has been mown under we're dealing with power lines, and power lines, you need your electricity, and the power easement runs along the railroad bed. There are two railroad beds. One is the main line that is now abandoned, and the other is an interurban, and they're parallel to each other and adjacent to each other. Well, power lines don't like trees because they can short to trees. But we don't have many trees on some of this stuff. So the prairie gets mown. So it gets mown usually starting August the 1st. It's a sort of nominal day. And the vegetation that is coming up now is about 2 months old, and it gives people a chance to see vegetation in that's been delayed because it's been mown. And adjacent is a regular prairie. So I took some photographs of that, and the Samantha's shamrocks. I'm sorry, the shamrocks removed some trees, young trees, and they enjoyed seeing the prairie in 2 different stages of growth, and then removed reed canary grass. So just keeping an eye on that. I have to deal with Amarin. The towers that are there were put in 1928, and their base, which is spread, it tends to rot, and so they have to replace the towers. And how do you do that? Do you mow all our prairie, or and so we're going to meet out there and look at this and see how Amarin can help to preserve the prairie while they replace their towers. They have 2 lines, and the lines are administered by different people. So the mainline stanchions are on what used to be the main line. But there's also a local feed that's on the interurban. So 2 different administrators and engineers mostly that are involved. So we'll meet there, and I hope to introduce them to some prairie that they might not be aware of. They do a lot of herbiciding too, so how do we check with that sort of mowing and that sort of herbiciding? On the other end, near White Heath, the Champaign, Havana and Western Railroad is wanting to plant a tree that for us it's a weed tree. They're like conifers, and so we have iHelp coming up shortly, and the idea is to plant what we regard as weed trees. So I've had quite a bit of conversation with the Champaign, Havana and Western Railroad to make sure that we don't have invasive trees planted on our railroad bed. Yes, I'm running out of steam here a little bit. I'm trying to think of some of the other things we've done this week. On Monday morning, starting from here at 9 o'clock, we will be going to the Pope Prairie, north of Rantoul on the Bloomington Moraine, and we'll be taking out teasel. It's getting mature enough that we need to remove the seed pods, and even if you can only come for half an hour, you find out where we are and where the prairie is and what it looks like and how we can access it and how we can relate that 10 mile to Braxton to 3 mile of railroad beds going east-west. And how does that in turn relate to the Kickapoo Trail? So if anyone wants to come along, you can bring your own car if you need to escape. We'll be there probably for about 2 hours. That's about good enough time to be there. It's probably fairly warm. Wear good boots and pants and hat, and bring some nibbles and water.
There's some rain in the forecast. If it's looking pretty bad or it's actually actively raining, should they just assume it's called off, or should they maybe call you
Give
first?
me a call. The phone number is 840-1911. 840-1911. Yes, actually, we can still work in showery time, and sometimes it's kind of a little cooler and nice to work with. Not all of our area is in swampy areas, so we're very pleased with it. It's doing regrowth succession work. And the Kickapoo Trail is also having a celebration each year. They've had a fundraiser at the Sleepy Creek event in Oakwood. So it's coming up. Keep your eye on it. I don't know whether I have the date here. It'll be around about the 1st of November. Mm-hmm. The Rattlesnake Master Run for the Prairie is coming up soon too, and they're looking for volunteers that will control the rather popular running event, and that's with the Grand Prairie Friends. So get hold of the Grand Prairie Friends if you're wanting to check that. I think we're getting.
That's about it.
This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.